Ceann Comhairle. And the first thing I'd like to say is I support the bill. The last year and a half has been incredibly difficult. There were mistakes made, and there is no question about that. I would have to say that I still cannot understand why we didn't control people who were returning from Italy in the spring of last year. We knew that was the main source. I still can't understand why we didn't say to people who went to Cheltenham that they'd have to quarantine for 2 weeks. I still have serious, serious misgivings in relation to how the nursing home issue was handled, discharging people in the nursing homes who potentially had COVID. And I believe in time that in 20 years' time, 30 years' time, just as we look back at things in previous generations, that particular episode will be examined fully, and I'm not sure that we'll come out in a good light over that. I'd have to say also, unless there's an extreme emergency, it's well known that I oppose guillotines in the Dáil. It's well known that I believe in talking things out, in giving everybody their say, until at least you've done your best to persuade them to your point of view and they've done their best to persuade you to their point of view. But when I look at the bigger scene, and when I look at it from a human point of view, from a community point of view, from the ordinary people's point of view, I have to look at what would have happened if we hadn't had restrictions and pit that against what did happen because we had restrictions. And at every step of the way, as any human being would be doing, I would be looking at details of what was done and saying, why did you do that and why did you not do that? Sometimes I thought the government was too strict, some other times I thought they were too lax. But they're matters of detail, but the general position is that, in my view, we did need controls. And I think we have to admit that COVID has taken a huge toll. We have a significant number of deaths. We have people who are suffering from long COVID. We have mental health issues. We have young people who have lost well over a year of their lives in very constrained circumstances at a period of their lives that they should either have been in college mixing with a whole lot of new people for the first time, or in school doing all the things that young people do. I have to hand it to the young people of Ireland for their solidarity, because they have shown solidarity to a disease that would be much easier on them in the generality of these things, statistically, than it is on those who are in the older population. I'm absolutely glad that we seem to be getting into a better place, and I got a whole lot of letters, emails, didn't manage to answer them all, but people on about the restrictions and about this bill. And my reply was, taking the practical effect of the bill, quite simple, and that is that we are, and the government is, rolling back the lockdown. But it is a balance, and a tricky balance, as we found out at Christmas. It's a balance between opening up and not allowing the genie out of the bottle again. It's a race between opening up and the rollout of the vaccine. We seem to be stuck at about 400 cases a day. We have 40 people in ICU at the moment. I have been watching the British figures for a long time, day by day, and when I translate them taking their population into account against ours, and allowing that they're 6 weeks ahead of us in the vaccine rollout, they have, for a long period, been at about 100 to 200 cases a day. So in relative terms, we're worse. And at this moment of time, they again are on a much lower number, equivalent to the population, than we are in ICU. So we are in a delicate position. Don't open up, and I think that people will move on. Open up too fast, and we might go backwards with the spread of the disease. And yes, it was very, very difficult. You had separated families separated from their loved ones. I have grandchildren that we've only seen a handful of times. I have a new grandchild in England that we haven't seen at all. We have family in Australia. And these are all difficult realities. So none of us are immune to what all this meant. But the reality was, in the human level, and we can be over-legalistic about everything, but the real choice was, which was better? To make all of those sacrifices, to take all of those inconveniences, to not visit the neighbours, to not go to all of the things that you'd normally go to not meet constituents who had problems and try to do it other ways. Which was better, to do that and to try come out the other side of this in the whole year of health? And the reality was that, as one of the older members of the House, but I would think I'd probably take as much physical exercise as most, do about 10K every day. I'm active. I'm in the whole of my health. I haven't had a sick day, I can't remember in how many years. But what I'm told statistically, that somebody of my age would be at very high risk if they caught COVID. And speaking for my generation, I really, really thank the younger generations who were willing to take restrictions because they knew that the older generation would be hugely vulnerable to this, even if the risk for them was much less. And up until Christmas, I was getting a lot of people saying the restrictions are way too strict. And then January and February happened. The hospitals were full. I remember one lady, I knew her very well. Thankfully, I don't know that many people who were in the whole of health who died from this disease. I was talking to her in the beginning of January. Knew her well, she used to be on the phone, she was a widow, she was living on her own. What happened to her in her case was, a friend came to visit. Cup of tea, they went for a drive, the friend didn't realize that she had COVID. This lady got it, she was dead by the end of the month. If she hadn't caught COVID, there's no reason to believe she wouldn't be in the whole of her health today. Now, I hear from the debate this evening people talking about capacity in the health service. And of course we need capacity in the health service, and that issue has to be addressed, but that doesn't answer the COVID dilemma. I don't think that we tried to control COVID because we didn't have capacity in the health service. It was a factor, particularly in the beginning. But the other factor was that preventative medicine is always a much better cure for a vast bigger number of the population than trying to cure them when they do get sick. That's why we have all the campaigns against smoking. That's why we encourage people to take exercise. That's why we have so many checks on people's health, because the whole effort should be to avoid, no matter what your capacity in the health service would be, is to try and minimise the amount of people who would wind up in a hospital. And I think everybody who reflects on it would say that hospitals and care are hugely important when you need it. But they're the last option. It's much better never to wind up there if it can be avoided at all. And I do think one other thing that comes out of this, and certainly one great thing that came out of it, I see around where I live, and with some magnificent scenery and so on, and we're willing to share it to anybody who wants to come. Great places. And I think one great positive thing has been the huge appreciation that people have got about exercise, about the great outdoors, about nature, about a different type of life than maybe they were living beforehand. In some cases, people had more time at home because they were working from home. So I would hope out of this whole episode, there will be good things, as there always are out of things like this, and one of them could be a much better work-life balance for people who've got young families. That they wanted to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and leave the kid at the creche at 7 and go home at 7 or 8 at night, try look after the kids and tumble out of the bed the next day. That many more of them will be able to live a much more civilized life. And they will be able to work from home maybe 2 or 3 days a week. And even the days they go in at times that are not the rush hour where you're sitting an hour and a half in the traffic, in a journey that might take you half an hour to 3/4 of an hour at an off-peak time. Now, there seems to be some worry in the ether that lockdown would last forever. And I have to say that I don't really buy into that. Because I think if there was no real good reason as the people saw it, not as the barristers and the lawyers and the solicitors see it, but as the people see it, if they didn't think lockdown was needed, you wouldn't get any compliance. And one thing I think we have to say, in practice, enforcement of all of this has been benign, in the main, reasonable and proportionate. And none of these regulations would have worked if the vast majority of the people, and I mean the vast majority of the people, didn't in their heart and soul know that in the generality of what was going on, there was a need for it on health grounds, that it was in their interest. And I believe the vast majority of people adhered to the rules because they knew in their heart and soul that it was for their good it was being done. But in the very unlikely situation that any government would think they could continue this when there was no risk or no significant risk to the people, I think they'd be absolutely foolish, because the people would do what the people would do, and they obviously would not do what they have done. They wouldn't comply. And in reality, all of the other lockdowns or partial lockdowns and partial reopenings were in a different scenario. So far, it would appear that the vaccines are very, very effective in stopping transmission, in stopping people getting it asymptomatically, symptomatically, winding up a hospital and winding up in ICU. And all you have to do is look at the NPHET, or not the NPSC, the HPSC epidemiological report, which show you that as we move down the age cohorts of people with the vaccine, the incidence of the disease is collapsing. The incidence of hospitalizations are collapsing amongst the group amongst whom we had the greatest number of deaths and hospitalizations. So I have to say that I don't see it lightly, and I hope that we won't have to continue with lockdowns, and I'm very confident that we won't, and that COVID is something that science is beginning to catch up with. And even if new variants came, that they will be able to vary, as they do with the flu, the vaccine to deal with any possible mutation in the future. So the situation as I see it is, the government have a tricky decision to make on the advice of NPHET, but in the end of the day, it's not NPHET that are making decisions, it's government. And that is, how quick do you open up, and how confident are you when you do that the disease will stay under control? And we are lucky in one thing, that Britain has got ahead of us. We're very, very lucky that we know there's a country across the water with a massive population that's 6 weeks ahead of us, that has opened up way more than we have, even on this island. There are 6 counties where there's been a much greater opening up, and because they've got to a level of vaccine, it does appear they can control the disease, and that you can do it in a stable way. So I think the portents are good. And the final thing I would say, and I have only a few minutes, human and civil liberties are hugely important. And there are huge protections within the constitution of this state for people's civil liberties. Your home and its inviolability, the right to public assembly, the right to free association, and so on. And I have no doubt that if any government were mad enough to go beyond the point of reason and the point of balance and the point of overwhelming scientific evidence, will continue with lockdown into the future. First of all, I don't think this Dáil would pass it. But even if we all got a rush of blood to our head, I would imagine that somebody would take a case into the court on constitutional freedoms. And I have no doubt that the Supreme Court would rule in their favour if they didn't believe there was an overwhelming argument in favour of the restrictions. So there are a lot of protections here. And sometimes people who look through the microscope all the time don't get the big picture. Don't get the big scene as the ordinary people who don't spend their days delving into the minutiae of law see it. And I'd summarise it as this. We were faced with an unprecedented situation. And as I pointed out, there are details of how it was handled that I definitely would argue with. Sometimes, as I said, I thought it was way too strict, other times not so strict. I think intrinsically there was a high compliance with the advice and the directives from government because the people understood, the ordinary people understood the risk. They understood that even if there were no rules, that it was in their own interest. Now, some people thought they were too strict. I had them on one hand pulling out of me that way, and other people thought that we were too lax altogether and were giving out yards to me, that we weren't strict enough, and why wasn't the government doing, a much bigger enforcement job. I remember getting frantic phone calls about people down on beaches in Connemara last year. They were too close together. Now, I have to say, I think the risk was slight, and I always thought so because, as I used to say to them, if you got an air freshener, you empty the freshener can, it wouldn't last long in the wind on a Connemara beach on a winter's day. But they were afraid. And therefore, we must continue to try to get the balance right. We must continue to try to keep the people with us. I think the majority of the people have accepted the need for what was done to date. And what I would hope now is that at the end of this week, Minister, we'll go another step on a process, and that every 2 or 3 weeks from now on, as the vaccine rolls out, and that is the key to everything we're doing, the faster we can do the vaccine, the more we can get not only 1, but 2 injections to all those who are eligible for them, and that's all adults over 18. To me, that's how we free up the country, not by changing the law, but by rolling out the vaccine ever faster.
Thank you very much.